Right, well, it's not my proudest piece of editing, but I hope it gets the point across. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, you may have guessed already, but today we're taking a look at this, the GTX 480 from Nvidia. This is a Fermi card, and over the years it's been the butt of many jokes and memes, simply because it's known for running hot, being very hungry in terms of power consumption, and just being a beast in general. Although these days, well, its performance leaves a lot to be desired, but that's to be expected. In 2010 this was certainly top dog, and these days you can pick one up for a pretty decent price. I paid £25 for this at my local CEX, and because it still supports DirectX 11 and will therefore run most of the newest games out there, I just had to see what it could do. But my experience with this card wasn't without a few problems, so I'm going to jump straight into it, and let's take a look at the card I've got here first of all. This is the Sparkle version. As you can see, it's got the traditional Nvidia blower style cooler on it. It features 1.5 gigs of VRAM. It requires one 8-pin and one 6-pin connector, and on the top here you've got two DVI ports as well as a mini HDMI port. Now, I've got to be honest, the GTX 480 is one of my all-time favourite cards, despite what you may think of its modern day performance, and apparently I'm not the only one. Harry seemed to take a liking to it as well. Alright, he might have been trying to chew it, okay, but that's besides the point. Without further ado though, let's take a more in-depth look at the specs of this card, talk about a couple of issues I had when firing up some modern titles, and then talk about whether or not it's worth buying one, because at this price, well, it's a very tempting deal indeed. So what you get with the Sparkle GeForce GTX 480 is a card that shares the same specs as the reference Nvidia model. It's got a 700 MHz core clock, a 1401 MHz shader clock, and of course 480 CUDA cores. I love the design of this. It's solid, it's a pretty sturdy card, and even today it looks great in any PC. These heat pipes out the top here also look pretty gnarly too. Now, as a single card you need a 600 watt power supply, and you should expect it to run quite warm. This also supports, though, for anyone out there daring enough, up to 3-way SLI. Battlefield 5 is the first game up, and I want to talk a little bit about this first because to get this running I needed to run a custom .bat file, the script for which I found on Reddit. If you try and run Battlefield 5 on a GTX 480 you'll probably get an error regarding the drivers, because driver support ended for Fermi last March with version 391.35. So trying to run the game with a GTX 480 will give you an error and say that your drivers are incompatible. What I did is copy and paste this custom script from Reddit, saved it as a .bat file, ran that before I ran the game, and well, it allowed the game to run fine. I'm sure we were using the low settings, but we were running at full HD resolution, and I have to say I was pretty surprised with the initial outcome here. Now, Farcry New Dawn also ran at 1080p. We didn't have to make any modifications here. We were using the low settings but averaged 40 frames per second. Now, interestingly enough, there was a little bit of a graphical problem at the end of this clip. I'm not sure if this had to do with the temperature of the card or whether it was just a game glitch, but as we get onto that a little bit later on, you'll see that the screen suddenly goes just plain grey, and I really couldn't do anything. I had to turn the PC off and on again, but for now, let's take a more in-depth look at the gameplay. As you can see, in most cases around the map, you'll average around 40 frames per second. I would consider this playable if 30 FPS is a target of yours. Capping it to 30 FPS may be better for you to avoid any stutters, things like that. But I think the only way you're going to see 60 or closer to it is to drop the resolution or resolution scale. Metro Exodus now. This is of course the newest entry to the Metro series of games, a game series that I do quite enjoy. However, nothing we could do here would allow us to run the game on a GTX 480 with reasonable frame rates. We had to drop things down to 720p, turn everything down to low, and even then we were seeing just 27 FPS on average. It was close to 30, but not quite. I apologise for visibility in this level here. I just decided to test the game from where I last left off, and it just so happens that this was that level. Now, I'm not sure how gameplay would differ when you're in the metro, things like that, but just know that when you are out in the open, you may see lower than 30 FPS, and it could be a game-breaking experience, especially if you're going from 30 FPS in one place to the low 20s in others, because it does get that low in some instances. Now, instead of 720p, when it came to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we turned things down to 900p, and this granted us with at least 30 frames per second on average here, though we did experience a little bit of a graphical glitch with Lara Croft. I'm not quite sure what happened to her here, but I seem to recall this occurring with another card I've tested in the past as well, a slightly older card. Perhaps it was on the same architecture, I can't quite remember, but if you want to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's doable at low settings with 900p resolution. Just know that you'll likely run into a few graphical glitches. This is perhaps due to the end of driver support, so bear that in mind, as it's not something that was exclusive to this title, because as we move on to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you'll see that not only did we fail to achieve a 30 FPS average, but there were a few flickering trees here. The foliage was sort of doing its own thing throughout our gameplay test, and because of this and the low frame rate, I don't think this one can be considered playable either. Now, this was with a 100% resolution scale. You may be able to achieve 30 frames per second or above if you turn that down a little bit, and providing you're not put off by the trees here, then it may be playable for you. The 480 is certainly giving it a good go. After all, it's the trying that matters, right? Now, Fortnite, unsurprisingly, at 1080p, averaged around 70 FPS. This was pretty decent performance here. For the £25 that the card cost, even if you used it exclusively for games such as Fortnite or CSGO or something like that, then it could still be considered a pretty decent GPU. That being said, Fortnite can also run on lesser hardware than the 480 as well, so just bear that in mind. Finally, it's an older one, but it's still a good one. Witcher 3 here, 1080p, low settings, at least 40 FPS on average. We probably could have turned things up to medium and still achieved at least 30, or turned things down to 720p for a closer to 60 FPS experience. Now, in The Witcher 3, I also took this opportunity to test the temperature of this 480 because it was getting louder and louder, and as we made our way into the city here, you can see the Celsius is slowly beginning to rise. The fan was getting ridiculous at this point, and yeah, the temperature just kept going up, and I was quite unsure as to whether or when it was going to stop. In fact, the room suddenly started feeling a little bit warmer. Was it that bad? Well, 10 minutes later. Okay, so the card might have made the room a little bit hotter, but it's not that noticeable. So the RX 480, what am I talking about? The GTX 480, Nvidia's Fermi card from 2010. In fact, the fastest card you could buy at one point. Is it still worth it today? Well, in esports titles like Fortnite, you'll still have a pretty great time, even at 1080p resolution. We used medium settings in today's video, but I think that you could probably push things to high and still retain a 60 FPS average. You may see a few frame dips here and there, but I think overall you're going to have a pretty decent experience. The GTX 480 is still capable in other areas too. In Battlefield 5, for example, although we did have to tweak the game settings a little bit in order to get it to run, it was a pretty surprising result once we had done that. And I've often found that Battlefield is more CPU intensive anyway, but to get it up and running pretty well on this 9-year-old card is an impressive feat. And just look at this card, it still looks pretty awesome. It's going to be quite hard to run modern AAA titles on, I'll admit, but for those less demanding ones, well, you can't really go wrong with an old beast like this, providing you have the power supply for it, of course, and you don't mind a rise in your electricity bill. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the GTX 480. I've certainly had a fantastic time checking it out today. If you did, leave a like on it. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know if you still use one of these in your system and what you use it for, what games you play. And all that's left to say now is hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.